She kissed him before she had time to think. The street froze in a sharp breath, the kind that steals sound from the air. 1 second ago, the man had been cornered, his back pressed against the cold brick wall, 3 angry fingers closing in with fists clenched and eyes burning. The next second, her hands were on his pillow, her lips on his, and the world shifted into
This is nice.
Gasps rippled
It
through the
is,
narrow street.
with you.
Someone laughed nervously. Someone else swore under their breath.
I'm glad
the
we
men who had
came.
been
Me
advancing
too.
stopped short, their aggression cracking into uncertainty. The stranger stiffened in shock, his body rigid as if he feared moving would shatter whatever spell had just fallen over them. What the hell is this? One of the men muttered. She pulled back just enough to rest her forehead against the stranger's, breathing hard, her heart slamming so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. I'm sorry, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. Trust me, he didn't know why he did, but he nodded. She turned to face the man, her arm sliding through his as if it belonged there. Is there a problem? She asked, forcing her voice to steady. My husband and I are late. Husband. Another man scoffed, eyes darting between them. The stranger swallowed, then did the unthinkable. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. Yeah, he said, his voice rough but convincing. There a problem with that? The men hesitated. In a city where reputation mattered and misunderstandings could turn ugly fast, uncertainty was often enough. One by one, they backed away, muttering insults that lacked real conviction. Watch yourself, the first man said, pointing a finger before retreating. When they were gone, the street slowly returned to life. Doors creaked open, footsteps resumed, the tension drained like water down a gutter. She stepped back immediately, cheeks burning. I'm so sorry, she said again. I didn't know what else to do. The stranger stared at her, disbelief written across his face. He looked younger up close, though exhaustion lined his eyes. You saved me, he said. She shrugged awkwardly. Anyone would have. No, he replied softly. They wouldn't. They stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. The moment felt fragile, temporary, like something that didn't quite belong to either of them. My name's Eleanor, she said finally, offering a hand. He hesitated, then took it. His palm was warm, rough with work. Thomas. Well, Thomas, she said with a weak smile, you're welcome. And I should probably go before I make things worse. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Wait, she looked back. Why did you do it? He asked. You didn't know me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth hovered on her tongue, too personal, too raw. I know what it's like, she said instead. To be alone when things turn bad. Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps. He nodded once. Thank you, truly. She walked away before the moment could stretch any further, before she could second guess herself. She didn't see Thomas remain where he was, watching her disappear into the crowd, her figure already blurring into memory. Eleanor told herself it was nothing. Just a reckless impulse, a foolish act driven by adrenaline. By the time she reached her apartment, she was convinced she would forget his face within days. She was wrong. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt again the shock of that kiss, the solid reassurance of his arm around her waist, the way his voice had steadied when he called himself her husband. It disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. She had lived carefully for years, ever since loss had taught her the cost of attachment. Helping a stranger was one thing. Feeling this strange pull was another. Across the city, Thomas sat alone in his rented room, staring at the cracked ceiling. He replayed the moment over and over, the fear, the sudden warmth, the unbelievable courage of a woman who had stepped into danger without hesitation. He didn't know her story, but he knew this. Her act had changed something in him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel invisible. Morning came too quickly. Eleanor wrapped herself in routine, convincing herself that yesterday belonged to the past. Work, errands, polite smiles. Life moved on, until, late in the afternoon, she stepped out of a bookstore and nearly collided with him. They froze simultaneously. You, Thomas said, surprise breaking into a smile. Her heart stumbled. You're fine, she blurted out, then winced. I mean, of course you are. He laughed, a quiet sound that eased her nerves. I was hoping I'd see you again, he admitted. She raised an eyebrow. Hoping. I wanted to thank you properly, he said. Maybe buy you a coffee. She hesitated. This was exactly the kind of thing she avoided. Connections led to expectations. Expectations led to loss. But she remembered the fear in his eyes, the way he had trusted her without question. She sighed. One coffee. They walked together, an unfamiliar comfort settling between them. Conversation came easily, cautiously at first, then with growing warmth. She learned he was new to the city, chasing work that never quite lasted. He learned she had once loved deeply and lost everything she thought was permanent. Neither of them said it, but both felt it. That kiss had not been an ending. It had been a beginning they hadn't seen coming. And somewhere, quietly, fate watched them step closer, smiling at the secret Eleanor still didn't know, that saving a stranger would cost her the very safety she had built, and give her something far more dangerous in return. Hope. Eleanor tried to convince herself that the coffee meant nothing. Just a polite gesture, a brief pause in two separate lives that would soon drift apart again. Yet as she sat across from Thomas in the small cafe, watching the steam rise between them, she felt the lie unravel. You look like you're waiting to run, Thomas said gently. She stiffened, then gave a thin smile. Habit. He nodded as if he understood more than she'd said. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows, blurring the city into streaks of gray. The sound wrapped around them, intimate and isolating. They talked longer than planned. About books, about streets that felt safer than others, about how loneliness could exist even in crowded rooms. Eleanor surprised herself by laughing, a real laugh she hadn't heard from her own mouth in a long time. When they finally stood to leave, dusk had settled in. The rain had slowed, the air smelling clean and sharp. Thank you, Thomas said again, this time quieter. For yesterday, and for today, she shrugged, suddenly shy. You're welcome. They parted at the corner, no promises exchanged. Eleanor walked home telling herself that was the right way to do things. Clean, simple, but over the following days, the city seemed intent on pushing them together. A chance meeting at a market, a nod across a busy street, a shared smile that lingered longer than it should have. Each encounter chipped away at the careful distance Eleanor had built around her heart. Thomas didn't push. He never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he offered steady presence, an openness that felt both comforting and terrifying. One evening, Eleanor found herself inviting him to walk with her. The words escaped before she could stop them. They wandered along the river, the lights reflecting off the dark water like scattered stars. Silence settled between them, not awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. Can I ask you something? Thomas said at last. She hesitated, then nodded. Why do you keep people at arm's length? Her steps slowed. She considered deflecting, joking, changing the subject. Instead, she stopped walking altogether. Because the last time I didn't, she said, it destroyed me. The confession hung in the air. Thomas didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the space. I loved someone, she continued, her voice steady despite the ache rising in her chest. I built my entire future around him. And then one day, he was gone. Just like that. No warning. No goodbye. Thomas's jaw tightened. I'm sorry. So I learned, she said quietly. Safety is distance. He looked at her, really looked, as if memorizing the way pain had shaped her. And yet, he said, you stepped in front of 3 angry men for a stranger. She laughed bitterly. I didn't say I was logical. They resumed walking. Thomas didn't take her hand, but his presence felt closer, warmer. What about you? She asked. Why were they after you? He exhaled slowly. Wrong place, wrong time. I owed someone money I didn't have. They wanted to make sure I remembered. Fear prickled along her spine. Are you in danger? Not anymore, he said, though his eyes suggested uncertainty. That night, Eleanor lay awake again, replaying the conversation. She told herself caring was a mistake, but the thought of Thomas being hurt stirred something fierce and protective inside her. Days later, that fear became real. Eleanor was closing her shop when she saw them across the street. The same men, watching, waiting. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She crossed the street without thinking, ignoring the voice in her head screaming at her to turn back. Thomas, she hissed, grabbing his arm. He followed her gaze and swore under his breath. I didn't think they'd find me again. They can't, she said, though she didn't know how she'd make that true. Come with me. They ducked into her building, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. Inside her apartment, Eleanor locked the door, leaning against it as her pulse raced. I'm sorry, Thomas said. I didn't mean to drag you into this. You didn't, she snapped, then softened. I chose this. They stood too close, the tension thick between them. For the first time since that kiss, neither of them pretended it hadn't meant something. A loud knock shattered the moment. Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas moved instinctively, placing himself between her and the door. Stay back. Her chest tightened at the gesture. Fear and gratitude tangled painfully together. Another knock, harder this time. Thomas looked at her, apology written across his face. If I open that door, you won't, she said, surprising both of them. You're not facing this alone. She reached for his hand. He squeezed it once, grounding himself. When the knocking came again, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. You have the wrong apartment. Leave. Silence followed, then muffled voices, footsteps retreating. They waited long minutes before relaxing. Eleanor sagged against the wall, trembling. Thomas turned to her. You shouldn't have done that. I know, she said. Seems to be a pattern. He smiled faintly, then grew serious. I don't want to put you at risk. Then don't disappear, she replied. Talk to me. Let me help. He searched her face, seeing the resolve there. Slowly, he nodded. That night, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, Eleanor realized something had shifted irreversibly. Distance no longer felt safe. It felt empty. She didn't know it yet, but the choice she'd just made would bind their lives together in ways neither of them could escape. And somewhere in the quiet of her apartment, the truth waited patiently to surface. The truth that Thomas was not just a stranger she had saved, but a man whose past was far more dangerous, and whose future was about to collide violently with her own. Eleanor did not sleep that night. The city outside her window breathed in slow, restless sighs, and every sound felt sharper, closer. Thomas sat at her small kitchen table, staring into a mug of untouched tea as if it held answers he was afraid to read. When morning came, gray and heavy, reality settled in. You should leave the city, Eleanor said quietly. For a while, Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes. Run, survive, she corrected. He shook his head. They won't stop. Not until the debt is settled. She frowned. How much? Enough to ruin me, he said honestly. And anyone standing too close. Silence stretched. Eleanor felt the weight of his words sink into her bones. She had spent years building walls, choosing solitude because it felt safe. Now, without meaning to, she had invited danger inside. And yet, when she looked at Thomas, she knew she would not push him away. There has to be another way, she said. There is, he replied. But it's risky. She didn't hesitate. Tell me. Thomas leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. The man I owe works through intimidation, not law. If I can get proof of how he operates, names, transactions, it gives me leverage. Protection. You want to expose him. I want him to leave me alone. Eleanor swallowed. Fear flickered, but something stronger followed. Resolve. Then we do it together. Thomas studied her. This isn't your fight. She met his gaze steadily. You made it my fight the moment you stepped in front of that door. Something softened in his expression. Gratitude, mixed with something deeper. They moved carefully over the next few days. Eleanor changed her routines. Thomas stayed out of sight. The city felt different now, every shadow suspicious, every unfamiliar face a threat. But within the tension, something fragile and beautiful grew. They cooked together in silence that felt intimate rather than awkward. They shared stories late into the night, voices low, laughter soft. Eleanor found herself looking forward to small things, the sound of Thomas humming under his breath, the way he listened as if her words mattered. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows, Thomas spoke the question he'd been holding back. Do you regret it? She knew what he meant. The kiss, the choice, the danger. She considered carefully. I regret being afraid for so long, she said. Not this. He nodded slowly. I don't deserve what you're risking. Maybe not, she replied. But I'm not doing it because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I choose to. The words hung between them, powerful and terrifying. The following night, Thomas left to meet a contact who might help him gather evidence. Eleanor waited alone, nerves stretched tight. Every minute felt like an hour. When a knock finally came, her heart leapt painfully. It was not Thomas. The door burst inward before she could react. Hands grabbed her arms, dragging her back as panic exploded through her chest. "Easy," a voice sneered. "You made our friend very uncomfortable." They tied her to a chair, crude and efficient. Eleanor fought, screamed, but it was useless. Fear clawed at her throat, sharp and suffocating. "You like playing hero," the man continued. "Let's see how brave you are now." Minutes blurred. Time lost meaning. Then the door crashed open. Thomas. He moved without hesitation, desperation lending him strength. Chaos erupted. Shouts, blows, the sound of something breaking. Eleanor cried out his name, terror and relief crashing together. Sirens wailed in the distance. The men fled. Thomas rushed to her, hands shaking as he cut the bindings. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I never should have left you alone." Eleanor collapsed into him, sobbing. His arms wrapped around her, solid, real, anchoring her to the world. "I thought I'd lost you," he said. "You didn't," she replied, though her voice trembled. "We're still here." Police reports followed. Statements. Questions. Protection was promised, but Eleanor knew promises were thin shields. In the aftermath, exhaustion settled deep into her bones. She expected regret to follow. Fear to convince her she had made a terrible mistake. Instead, clarity came. She had been afraid of pain her entire life. But pain had found her anyway. And yet, here she was, still standing, still choosing. Days later, Thomas prepared to leave the city temporarily under police advice. Eleanor stood with him at the station, heart heavy. "This isn't goodbye," he said. She nodded, forcing a smile. "I know." He hesitated, then leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "That kiss," he murmured. "It saved my life. But meeting you, that changed it." Tears burned her eyes. "Come back," she whispered. "I will," he promised. As the train pulled away, Eleanor felt fear and hope twist together inside her. She didn't know what waited ahead. Danger, loss, love. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Saving a stranger had awakened something she could never silence again. And when Thomas returned, the truth she still did not see would rise at last. That the man she had risked everything for carried a secret powerful enough to shatter the fragile future she had begun to believe in. The days after Thomas left felt unreal, as if Eleanor were moving through a version of the city that had lost its depth. Sounds came muted, colors dulled. She returned to her routines, opened her shop each morning, smiled at customers, answered politely when asked how she was. No one could see the quiet vigilance beneath her calm, the way every shadow still made her spine stiffen. At night, she slept with the lights on. Thomas called when he could. Short conversations, careful words. He never said where he was, only that he was safe for now. Eleanor told herself that was enough. She told herself she didn't need more. But distance had a way of sharpening truths instead of softening them. She missed him. Not just his presence, but the way he listened. The way he made silence feel shared instead of empty. It frightened her how deeply the absence cut, how quickly he had become woven into her life. 2 weeks passed. Then one evening, as Eleanor was locking up the shop, she felt it again, that unmistakable prickle of being watched. She turned slowly. A man stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He wasn't one of the three. Older, better dressed, calm in a way that set her nerves screaming. He smiled when their eyes met. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, fingers hovering over Thomas's name, then stopped. Whatever this was, she needed to face it clear-headed. She stepped toward the street. "Can I help you?" The man straightened, smoothing his jacket. "Eleanor Hale," he said pleasantly. "You don't know me, but I know you." Her jaw tightened. "That's rarely good news." He chuckled softly. "Smart. I like that." His gaze sharpened. "We should talk." "I disagree." He sighed, as if disappointed. "This doesn't have to be difficult. But it will be, if you insist." Eleanor crossed her arms, grounding herself. "If this is about Thomas, he's gone. Temporarily," the man corrected. "People like him always come back." Her chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You should leave." Instead, He stepped closer. Thomas owes a great deal. Not just money, information, choices, mistakes. Eleanor's mind raced. I don't know anything. That's what worries me, he said calmly. You see, Thomas has always had a habit of attaching himself to the wrong things. And now, to the wrong person. A chill slid down her spine. If you're trying to scare me, I'm trying to warn you, he interrupted gently. Stay out of his life. If you don't, consequences follow. Something in her snapped. Fear, yes, but beneath it, anger. You don't get to dictate who I care about. The man studied her for a long moment, then smiled again, colder this time. We'll see. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening crowd as if he'd never been there. Eleanor stood frozen long after he was gone. That night, she called Thomas despite the late hour. He answered on the third ring. Eleanor. His voice sharpened immediately. What's wrong? Her resolve crumbled at the sound of him. They found me, she said. Not the men. Someone else. Someone higher. Silence stretched on the line. Thomas, she whispered. He exhaled slowly. I was afraid of that. You knew, she said, hurt threading through her fear. I suspected, he admitted. I didn't want to pull you deeper. You don't get to decide that for me. I know, he said quietly. And I'm sorry. She closed her eyes. What aren't you telling me? The pause that followed told her everything. Thomas, I wasn't just in debt, he said at last. I used to work for him. Her breath caught. Work how? Logistics. Moving things. Information. I didn't ask questions. Until I saw what it was costing other people. His voice roughened. When I tried to leave, that's when it started. Eleanor sank onto the bed, heart pounding. You told me you were just in the wrong place. I was, he said. Years ago. And I've been paying for it since. Anger flared, sharp and sudden. You lied to me, yes. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the rush of emotion. Betrayal, fear, and still, concern. Are you in danger right now? Always, he said honestly. But more so if you're near me. A tear slipped free despite her effort. Then why does it feel like pushing you away would hurt worse? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was bare. Because you already let me matter. Days later, Thomas returned without warning. Eleanor opened her apartment door and froze. He stood there thinner, exhausted, eyes shadowed, but alive. Before she could speak, he said, I shouldn't be here. She stepped forward and hugged him anyway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas's arms came around her, tight and desperate. They warned me, she said into his shoulder. I know, he replied. That's why I came back. Her heart raced. That makes no sense. It does if I finish this, he said. They sat across from each other, the truth finally laid bare. Thomas explained everything. The records he'd kept, the names, the proof. Enough to destroy the man who'd threatened her, if delivered to the right hands. But once I do, he said, there's no hiding. It ends things. Or it ends me. Eleanor reached for his hand. You won't do this alone. He looked at her, fear and love tangled painfully together. If you stay, you'll be a target. If I leave, she said softly, I'll lose myself. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere far away. The city breathed on, indifferent. Thomas squeezed her hand. There's something else you should know. Her chest tightened. What? The reason he's so determined to stop me, Thomas said. The reason he's watching you. She held his gaze, dread coiling in her stomach. He believes your leverage, Thomas continued. And if he can't control me through fear, he'll try through you. The truth settled between them like a loaded weapon. Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Then we make sure he never gets the chance. Thomas stared at her, realization dawning. In that moment, they both understood. There was no returning to the life Eleanor had known before the kiss, before the danger, before Thomas. And whatever came next, love, loss, or survival, it would come for them together. Eleanor understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that there would be no turning back now. Fear no longer felt like something to avoid. It felt like a signal that she was standing at the edge of a truth she could no longer deny. She looked at Thomas, at the exhaustion etched into his face, and realized that despite everything he had hidden, despite the danger wrapped around him like a shadow, she trusted him. Not because he was safe, but because he was honest now. "We need a plan," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "I already started one. I just didn't expect you to be part of it." She gave a faint, humorless smile. Life seems determined to ignore expectations. They spent the night going over everything Thomas had collected. Names, dates, transactions scribbled in coded shorthand, digital backups hidden in places even he struggled to remember. Eleanor listened carefully, her mind sharp, asking questions Thomas hadn't expected. She saw patterns where he saw fragments. She saw leverage where he saw risk. "You could hand this to the authorities," she said. "Not all at once, in layers. Force them to act, and force him to move," Thomas replied. "Cornered people are dangerous. So are desperate ones," she said. "And he's both." As dawn crept in, painting the room in pale gray, a quiet resolve settled between them. Whatever came next would not be reactive. They would choose the timing, the exposure, the terms. For the first time since this began, Thomas felt something unfamiliar. Control. They separated for the day, carefully. Eleanor went to her shop, acting as normal as possible, though her senses stayed razor sharp. Thomas disappeared into the city, following threads only he could see. They spoke briefly, cautiously, never staying on the line long enough to be traced. By evening, Eleanor felt it again. Not being watched, being studied. She didn't turn immediately. She finished locking the door, slipped her keys into her pocket, then stepped into the fading light. When she finally looked up, the man was there again. The calm one, the one who smiled too easily. "You're persistent," she said evenly. "So are you," he replied, approaching without hurry. "That worries me." She met his gaze without flinching. "You don't scare me." "That," he said mildly, "is a mistake." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Eleanor could see the faint scar near his jaw, the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to power. "Thomas has always been an idealist," he continued. "Believes information is freedom. That truth protects. And you believe fear does," Eleanor said. "I believe outcomes matter," he corrected. "Methods are irrelevant." She folded her arms. "What do you want?" "To give you one last chance," he said. "Walk away. Leave the city. Forget him. And if I don't," his smile thinned, "then you become part of the lesson." Eleanor felt anger spark, sharp and bright. "You underestimate me." "Everyone does at first," he replied. "It's what makes disappointment so inevitable." He turned to leave, then paused. "Tell Thomas he has 48 hours. After that, consequences stop being hypothetical." When he was gone, Eleanor's hands shook, not with fear, but with fury. She called Thomas immediately. He set a deadline, she said. 2 days. Thomas was silent for a moment. Then, "Good." She blinked. "Good. It means he's nervous," Thomas said. "He wouldn't rush otherwise." That night, they met in a small, nearly empty apartment Thomas had secured under a false name. They worked relentlessly, assembling everything into a structure that could not be ignored. Eleanor took notes, organized timelines, cross-referenced names. She was precise, methodical, unafraid. Thomas watched her with a mixture of awe and guilt. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "You didn't choose me. I chose this." He reached for her hand, squeezing it once. "If this goes wrong." "It won't," she interrupted. Then softer, "And if it does, I'll still choose it." Something in Thomas broke open then. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, breathing her in as if anchoring himself. "I love you," he said, the words raw and unguarded. Her breath caught. She had told herself she wasn't ready. That she wouldn't say it back unless she was certain. She was. "I love you too," she whispered. The next day passed in fragments of tension and quiet preparation. Messages were sent through secure channels. Documents scheduled for release. Fail-safes activated. If Thomas disappeared, if Eleanor was harmed, everything would surface automatically. By nightfall, the city felt like it was holding its breath. They were together when it happened. The power cut out without warning, plunging the apartment into darkness. Thomas moved instantly, pulling Eleanor close. "Stay behind me." A crash at the door. Voices. Too many. "Now," Eleanor whispered. Thomas hit send on his phone. The door splintered inward. Shouts filled the room. A gunshot cracked the air. Then sirens. So many sirens. Chaos erupted as police flooded the building, lights flashing through broken windows. Shouts turned to panic. Orders barked. People ran. Thomas held Eleanor as the noise swallowed everything. Minutes later, they stood in the wreckage, shaken but unharmed, as officers moved through the apartment. Phones rang. Radios crackled. Names were spoken with sudden urgency. The man with the calm smile was arrested 3 blocks away, trying to disappear into the city that had always protected him. By morning, it was everywhere. Exposés, arrests, investigations unfolding like a long-delayed storm. The network unraveled faster than anyone expected, fear turning inward, allies turning on each other. Thomas watched the news in silence, disbelief slowly giving way to relief. "It's over," Eleanor said softly. He turned to her. "Is it?" She met his gaze, understanding the weight behind the question. Consequences lingered. Trauma didn't vanish. Trust would take time. But the danger, the constant, suffocating threat, had loosened its grip. "Yes," she said, "it is." Weeks later, life began to settle into something quieter. Not the same, never the same, but real. Eleanor reopened her shop fully. Thomas stayed, no longer hiding, cooperating fully with authorities. They moved carefully, learning how to exist without adrenaline dictating every choice. Some nights were still hard. Some fears returned without warning. But they faced them together. One evening, as they walked along the river where they had once spoken so cautiously, Thomas stopped. "You saved my life," he said. She shook her head. "You saved mine too, just differently." He smiled, reaching for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Not watching with threat, watching with interest. And far away, in places untouched by sirens or justice, something shifted quietly, an unanswered question forming, a loose end tightening. The story, though changed, was not finished yet. The sense of victory faded more quickly than Eleanor expected. It didn't vanish all at once. It thinned, like fog lifting unevenly, leaving cold patches behind. Life resumed its shape, but the edges no longer felt smooth. Every quiet moment carried echoes of what had almost happened. Thomas noticed it first. She flinched at sudden sounds. Checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times. At night, she woke reaching for him, breath sharp, eyes searching the dark as if danger still lurked there. "You're safe," he would whisper, holding her. Until the tremors eased. But safety, Eleanor was learning, wasn't a switch you flipped. It was something you rebuilt, brick by careful brick. Thomas had his own ghosts. The headlines praised him as a whistleblower, a man who had dismantled a dangerous network. What they didn't show were the moments he sat alone, staring at his hands, replaying every choice that had led him there. He wondered how close he had come to losing her. How close he had come to becoming the very thing he hated. They tried therapy, separately at first, then together. Some sessions ended in silence. Others in tears. Progress wasn't linear, but it was real. One afternoon, weeks later, Eleanor found Thomas standing in her shop doorway, holding a folded envelope. "What's that?" she asked. "An offer," he said carefully. "A job, consulting. Far away." Her chest tightened. "How far?" "Another city, another country, maybe, short term, but," he trailed off. "But it could turn into a life," she finished. He nodded. They didn't argue. They never raised their voices. That scared Eleanor more than shouting would have. She knew what the offer meant. Distance from the past, from the places that still smelled like fear. It also meant distance from her. "I don't want to run anymore," she said quietly. "I don't either," Thomas replied. "But I also don't want you paying the price for my history." She reached for his hand. "You're not my history. You're my present. And the future," he asked softly. She hesitated, not because she didn't want one, but because she was afraid to promise what she couldn't control. "The future scares me," she admitted. "But losing you scares me more." They agreed to think, to give it time. Neither of them slept much that night. The decision was made for them 3 days later. A letter arrived. No return address. No threat written plainly. Just a single line, cut from a newspaper and glued to the page. "You don't get to walk away." The old fear surged back, hot and immediate. Authorities were notified, extra precautions taken. But the message was clear. Not everyone had been caught. Some shadows still moved. Thomas folded the letter carefully. This is about me. Eleanor shook her head. It's about us. That night, they talked longer than they ever had, stripping everything down to truths they'd avoided. Thomas admitted he feared becoming a liability. Eleanor admitted she feared disappearing into caution again, losing the woman she'd become by choosing him. In the end, the choice was simple, if not easy. They would leave together, not to run, to breathe. They chose a coastal town, quiet, unfamiliar, anonymous enough to allow healing. Eleanor sold the shop to someone who loved it as much as she had. Thomas accepted the consulting role with strict boundaries and safeguards. The goodbye to the city was strange, bittersweet. Eleanor stood on the platform where she had once watched Thomas leave alone, heartbreaking in silence. This time, his hand was in hers. The town greeted them with wind and salt and wide, open skies. Days slowed. Nights grew quieter. Eleanor started painting again, something she hadn't done since before her loss. Thomas found peace in routines, early walks, long swims, steady work. They argued sometimes, about nothing and everything, but they learned how to fight without fear, how to apologize without pride. Months passed. Then one evening, as they sat watching the horizon burn gold and red, Thomas spoke softly. I used to think love was a weakness, he said. Something people used against you. Eleanor leaned into him. And now I think it's the only thing that ever made me brave. She smiled, eyes stinging. You already were. He shook his head. Not like this. The past didn't disappear. It never does. But it loosened its grip, allowing space for something new to grow. One night, a storm rolled in fast and wild. Thunder shook the windows. Eleanor startled awake, panic rising. Thomas held her, grounding her with steady breaths. I've got you, he murmured. She believed him. In the morning, the world was washed clean. The air smelled fresh, possibilities endless. Eleanor stood barefoot on the sand, watching waves erase footprints as quickly as they formed. She realized then that survival wasn't about erasing what had been, it was about choosing what came next. Thomas joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. What are you thinking about? She smiled, soft but certain. About how one reckless kiss changed everything. He laughed quietly. Worst decision of my life. She tilted her head. Liar. Best, he corrected. They stood there together, aware that danger could return, that love would always carry risk. But they also knew this. They had faced fear and chosen each other anyway. And that choice, made again and again, was stronger than any shadow still watching from afar. The quiet did not last forever. Eleanor knew that, even as she learned to breathe more deeply in the coastal air, even as her hands steadied and her sleep grew less fractured. Peace, she understood now, was not the absence of danger. It was the presence of choice. And choices, sooner or later, always carried consequences. It began with something small. A missed call on Thomas's phone from an unlisted number. He ignored it at first. Then it came again the next day. And the next. Never a message. Never a threat. Just the silent insistence of someone on the other end wanting to be noticed. Eleanor pretended not to notice the way his shoulders tightened each time the phone buzzed. But she noticed. You don't have to protect me from everything, she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the tide roll in. Thomas didn't look at her. I know. That's not the same as believing it. He sighed, finally turning to face her. Some dangers grow when you name them. And some grow when you don't, she replied softly. The call came again that night. This time, Thomas answered. He didn't speak. Neither did the caller. 10 seconds passed. Then the line went dead. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. The subtle tightening of the world, like the air before a storm. They found you, she said. Thomas nodded. Or they never stopped looking. They contacted authorities, again. Old names resurfaced. Old files reopened. But whatever shadow remained was smarter now. Quieter. Harder to pin down. Days passed without incident. Then weeks. Just as Eleanor began to believe the threat had been empty, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a single object. A photograph. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Her shop. The one she had sold. Taken recently. From across the street. Her hands went cold. Thomas saw her face and knew before she said a word. "They're reminding us," he said grimly. "That distance doesn't erase memory." Fear rose, but it did not paralyze her this time. Instead, it sharpened her focus. "Then we stop reacting," she said, "and start deciding." They made a choice that night. Not to hide, not to run again, to expose the last shadow fully, even if it meant stepping back into the light they had tried to leave behind. Thomas reached out to former contacts. Eleanor organized timelines, cross-referenced faces, locations, patterns. They worked like they had before, but differently now. With patience, with restraint, with trust. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A local fisherman mentioned a stranger asking questions. Someone too polished for the town. Someone who paid in cash and watched too closely. They followed carefully. No confrontation, no impulse. What they uncovered was not an empire, just a man. One survivor of the old network who had slipped through the cracks. Not powerful, not feared, just bitter, obsessed, unable to accept that the world had moved on without him. He wanted acknowledgement, control, a final word, and Eleanor, without meaning to, had become the symbol of what Thomas had gained by defying him. The arrest was quiet, almost disappointing. No sirens, no violence, just handcuffs and resignation. When it was over, Eleanor felt something unexpected. Not relief, release. Weeks later, as official confirmations arrived and doors finally closed for good, Eleanor stood alone on the beach at dawn. The sky stretched wide and pale, endless and forgiving. Thomas joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "It's really finished," he said. She nodded. "I know." He studied her face. "You're different. So are you," she replied. They had not escaped unmarked. They never would, but they had earned something rare. Freedom that didn't depend on fear. Later that year, Eleanor opened a small studio by the sea. She painted what she couldn't put into words. Storms breaking, hands reaching, figures standing unafraid at the edge of something vast. Thomas worked less, lived more, learned how to be still without feeling useless. One evening, as the sun sank low and the water burned gold, Thomas knelt in the sand. Eleanor laughed through tears before he could even speak. "Yes," she said. He smiled, relief and love flooding his face. "I didn't ask yet." "You didn't have to," she replied. As waves erased their footprints again and again, Eleanor understood something she had never known before. Love had not saved her. Choice had. Love had simply given that choice meaning. And long after danger faded into memory, long after fear lost its voice, that truth would remain, steady, quiet, unbreakable. The kiss that had once been reckless had become a promise. And this time, it was one she intended to keep. Life after the proposal unfolded gently, almost cautiously, as if the world itself were afraid to break what Eleanor and Thomas had rebuilt. They did not rush into plans or celebrations. Happiness, they had learned, was something to hold with open hands, not clenched fists. They announced their engagement quietly. No headlines, no drama, just a handful of calls, a few letters, and long conversations filled with laughter that felt earned rather than borrowed. Still, beneath the calm, Eleanor sensed something else growing, an unease she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. She had changed. The woman who once believed safety lived in distance no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that strength did not come from hiding, but from standing still when the world tried to push you back. Thomas noticed it too. "You don't disappear anymore," he said one night as they sat in the studio, Eleanor's unfinished paintings lining the walls. She glanced up from the canvas. "I didn't realize I was. You used to fade," he said gently. "When things got hard, you'd shrink yourself to survive. And now you take up space." The words warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She smiled. "So do you." Marriage brought questions neither of them had dared to ask before. About children, about permanence, about what kind of future could grow from ground that had once been scorched. Eleanor feared motherhood more than she admitted. The idea of loving something so completely, so helplessly, terrified her. Loss had taught her too well how fragile attachment could be. Thomas feared being a father for different reasons. He worried that his past would follow him, that his mistakes would stain someone innocent. They talked about it slowly, carefully, no pressure, no promises, Time continued its quiet work. One winter morning, Eleanor woke with a strange certainty humming through her bones. She sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, not with dread, but with disbelief. She took the test alone. When the result appeared, her breath caught so sharply she had to sit down on the floor. She was pregnant. For a long moment, she did nothing but breathe. Fear came first, then wonder, then a deep, unexpected calm. She told Thomas that evening as the sun dipped low, turning the sea to molten gold. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, she whispered, "You don't have to be ready." He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her, hands trembling as he rested them on her knees. "I've never been more ready for anything," he said, voice breaking. Eleanor cried then, not from fear, but from relief. Pregnancy softened some edges and sharpened others. Eleanor's body changed, but so did her patience, her perception. She felt fiercely protective, not just of the life growing inside her, but of the life she and Thomas had built. Thomas became careful in ways that bordered on reverent. He learned how to listen to her silences, how to read the tension in her shoulders, how to hold joy without trying to control it. They married in early spring. No grand venue, just the sea, the wind, and a small circle of people who had witnessed their transformation. Eleanor walked barefoot, dress simple, heart full. When Thomas looked at her, she saw not possession, but partnership. Their vows were honest. "I promise to choose you," Eleanor said, "even when fear tells me not to." "I promise to stay," Thomas replied, "even when running feels easier." The months that followed were the quietest they had ever known. The kind of quiet that healed instead of haunted. But the past, though subdued, had not vanished entirely. Late one evening, Thomas received a call from an unknown number. This time, he answered without hesitation. There was no threat, only information. A trial had concluded, a sentence finalized. The last remaining figure connected to the old network had been imprisoned permanently. No appeals, no loopholes. When he hung up, Thomas closed his eyes, shoulders sagging as something old and heavy finally lifted. "It's done," he said. Eleanor rested a hand over her stomach. "Then we really are free." Freedom, she discovered, did not feel explosive. It felt quiet. It felt like waking up without scanning the room. It felt like laughter that didn't stop halfway. As her due date approached, Eleanor found herself standing often at the water's edge, thinking about the strange path that had led her here. One reckless kiss, one moment of courage, 1,000 choices that followed. She realized something then. Love had never been the risk. Avoiding it had been. The night their child was born, the storm returned. Thunder rolled over the sea as Eleanor labored, gripping Thomas's hand with surprising strength. Pain surged and receded, fierce but purposeful. When the cry finally filled the room, Eleanor felt something inside her break open completely. Not fear, recognition. Thomas wept openly as he held their child, awe written across his face. "We made this," he whispered. Eleanor watched them, heart so full it almost hurt. In that moment, she understood the final truth. She had not been saved by love. She had not been destroyed by fear. She had been transformed by choice. And now, standing at the beginning of a new life, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty. Some kisses change moments, some change lives, and some, against all odds, change generations.